personalizing stuff. Okay, welcome back. Now, a couple of things. This is the passcode for the files that will be in the resources menu for all the files for this course. Okay. Now, logistics. I have not been able to get a room for this Sunday from 10 to 12:30. And as soon as I do get the room, I will let you know. The room will be in 7 East 12th Street. Everyone okay with that? Today's discussion will span 2 days. This, and at some point we will integrate this into our discussion of Heinz Goes to Rio. And there are some aspects of a part of this discussion that flows into Heinz. So you have to bear with me a little bit. Heinz will take a couple of sessions. And then next Thursday we will discuss Baupost. Is that okay, everyone? So, how does this world of international real estate work? And how do we put a framework around it, how we think about it? And as a consequence of that, what comes is some ways to think about cost of capital. These are some of the topics we'll cover. The framework for international transactions. Some of you who have been in my corporate finance class will be just a little bit familiar with this. And global urbanization trends, where the trends are. Is anyone in this class well versed with the trends, global trends? And if not, don't worry. We'll go through it and I will walk you through how that fits into cost of capital. Concepts like global imbalances, capital flows, and obviously we had the global financial crisis 10 years ago, now 11 years ago, and what are the consequences and how much have we recovered from it. Global real estate capital flow trends and framework for pricing global real estate transactions. This is critical. So transactions are primarily driven by 4 forces. The forces are, one is the demand formation of space. This could happen anywhere, locally, nationally, regionally, within the city, and is basically driven by the demand factors. You have capital formation. Capital responds to the need for space. There is a demand which is could be driven by a whole range of things. One, what could be the drivers of demand globally? Yes, you go.
Population increase.
Demographics, yes, population increase. What else?
Economic growth.
Economic growth, yes.
Increase in businesses.
Increase in business productivity. Okay, yes, all those are good. What else? What else do you think are the drivers of demand? Yes, Anmol?
Changes in consumer preferences.
Changes in consumer preferences, yes. Changes in business models, the nature of businesses, Miles.
Increase or decrease in political risk.
Yes, absolutely. The less the political uncertainty, hopefully there is more demand and growth. What else?
Inflation.
Yes?
Inflation.
Inflation. Okay, how so?
National, like Brazil, and when they were talking about how how it was studying their inflation, it was much larger before, but that was a factor why Heinz decided to move in.
Okay.
When they did.
Yes, Alex?
War.
What about war?
Well, after the war, there's usually reconstruction.
Reconstruction.
Or a natural disaster.
Sure, sure, absolutely. So demand can vary, and we'll go into specific factors, some of the other ones. And everybody is out there looking for where the demand is coming from. Predominantly, demand is driven by demographics and economic growth. Right? Now, on the other hand, there is capital which is being formed around the world. Where is predominantly the center of capital formation in the last 100, 150 years? Yes, Miles?
Yes.
Yes, North America, Europe,
Yeah.
right? Europe started a little earlier, and North America. And like the money we save, we put into 401k accounts that goes into a retirement fund, and when you put your money in a retirement fund, you expect some kind of a return in order for you to save for your own retirement, right? That money has to grow in order to fund your own retirement assets. So it is imperative that capital, wherever it is formed, is always has an eye on where the demand is coming from, right? And then capital knows where the demand is, but it doesn't directly go on to feed the demand. It has to go through a process, and that process is estimating the risks of the capital going to flow from here all the way here. It has to estimate the risk of what could happen in terms of the loss of capital, in terms of the return, all the uncertainties that happen with capital. And then once that is established, this basically acts like a constraint on the deployment of capital. Capital is not really free, and if capital is rational, it will not move all the way to support this. It will go through this process, right? And this is the critical process, because here you would always see, there is, what are my risk-adjusted returns? You've heard this term again and again and again. What does it mean to have a risk-adjusted returns? Risk-adjusted for what? Returns adjusted for risk. And we have studied risk in previous classes in corporate finance, did you guys study it in FIA? Not yet? Or in portfolio and risk management, right? So we had a view of risk which was a little bit more theoretical. But here, when you think about international risk, the intellectual canvas changes a little bit, or it goes deeper, evolves, becomes wider, and you really start thinking of risk in ways which includes things like country risk and other kinds of risks which you are typically you haven't dealt with when you are looking at purely a US-centric investment opportunity. Okay. So from there, once capital is priced, it goes on to fulfill first upgrade existing stock, then provide for new construction. And then it goes on to fulfill the demand of space, so this cycle keeps going on and on. Okay. Now let's look at this a little bit more in depth. Demand for space is reflected in rent levels, which are determined by supply-demand of space in market, economic conditions and growth expectations. Proximity or presence of economic clusters. Is everyone familiar with clusters? Economic clusters? What is the idea of an economic cluster? Yes, Alex.
It's a web of various industries that push each other to compete at a higher level. And so that can be, in Italy, the leather, sort of the leather industry is surrounded by shoemaking and other things. It creates a sort of sophisticated demand for the product, which pushes the industry to perform better and be more competitive on a global level.
Okay. Other thoughts? Yes, Nate.
Helps create economies of scale that are external to one company. So kind of historically, the idea with one company would try to vertically integrate and create the economies of scale and internally within one company, whereas these clusters create kind of a similar effect, but a company having to vertically integrate entirely, they're located close together so they can kind of use those services nearby to have a similar effect.
Yes. Co-location of similar industries allows for the economies of agglomeration, right? There is a benefit to companies in the similar arena or similar industry coming together. Why? Because they can share knowledge, they can share human resources, and they can share the factors of production which is readily available domestically or locally, and they can co-locate to expand, right? And so that's what's an economic. Silicon Valley is an economic cluster. The Baltimore corridor is also an economic cluster focused on healthcare or biotech. Kendall Square in MIT is a biotech cluster. Right? And they have the entire Chinese economy, the growth is around economic clusters. The strategy is designed around economic clusters. Proximity or distance from employment centers. How does this affect demand? Would you expect demand to be higher where there is a proximity to employment centers? Yes. Yes. Now, what depends on what kind of demand there is, right? So if you see across the world, there are cities where have large slums. Anyone familiar with slums? Yeah? Anybody a millionaire? The reason slums arise is because, what are the reasons? Let me ask you before I answer. Why could be the reason slums arise? Yes?
Income disparity?
Income disparity, but income disparity is always there between rural areas and urban areas, right? So that, people who want to live in the rural areas because they have less income and they don't have any mobility, upward mobility, they can stay there. They really don't have to come to a place and all squatter together. So, Alex and then.
Well, maybe there aren't enough opportunities in rural areas and people are forced to move to urban areas where jobs are still low paying and they can't be too far to work.
Okay, fair point. Anmol?
Yeah, I was going to say too much population, not enough jobs to sustain.
Right.
Or maybe lower paying jobs.
Yes, yes. Most of the employment, especially in the emerging countries, is centered around urban areas, right? As the economic logic of the agrarian economy has weakened, especially in places like China, in places like India. People have, in China, they have been asked to migrate in order to serve the economic growth from the rural areas to the fringes of the urban areas, right? And there is a whole hukou system. Hukou, how do you say that? Just for you? Huh? Hukou? H-U? Hukou.
Yeah.
Okay, pardon my pronunciation. Hukou system. We'll deal with hukou system when we discuss the case study in Chongqing. But what happens? People don't have ownership of land. They don't have a right to tenure on land. They just want to be close to whatever form of employment there is, and they, if there is not a dictatorship or a military rule which just holds them, which often happens in Argentina, right? They have barrios where people, slums are formed, but they can't really be moved. Examples are Dharavi in Mumbai, right? Favelas of Rio, in Mexico City. They acquire tenure by coming close to a place where they work. And because the cost of commute from the place of work to somewhere on the outskirts of the city is very, very high. So there is no real reason for them to locate. In Mumbai, the Dharavi is close to the center of city. We have Dharavi is one of the largest slums in the world. And they can't move them out of the city because people come back, keep coming back. They want to be close to the place of work. So it's a major, major problem. So generally people like to be close to employment centers, and that's what determines the demand of space. Regulatory constraints of demand of space, for example, what would be? Yes?
California. Right now, it's probably one of the hardest states to develop real estate because of all the different regulations surrounding, especially residential development.
Sure, absolutely. Many places around the world, everything there is a right set of demand metric. But demand also depends on what is the segment that is of interest to you in terms of demand. But go to places like Mumbai or, as you mentioned, California, there are structural obstructions to development of space. There have been cases in a city in Hyderabad in India. There's a city called Hyderabad. The government goes out and sells land. So when the government puts its mark on the sale of land, what happens? That means it can be as clean as possible. If the government in China sells land, do you think somebody is going to question that? The ownership of land? Nobody does, right? Because the government seal of approval is there. Now, so in a city in Hyderabad in India, the government goes out and it puts up land for sale. People buy it, many international companies buy it, international real estate investors. And then very soon they find out that somebody sues the government in the court of law that the land never belonged to the government. So what was the reason it didn't belong? Because the land, apparently, Hyderabad used to be a kingdom before. And the ruler of that kingdom had many concubines, like 300 years ago. And from them, some progeny came about, and the progeny said, oh, that part of land was gifted to me by my great forefathers, right? And this is the small document I have to show for it. There goes the right of the government to claim that the land is clean, right? So and India has quite a bit rule of law. Now, in spite of the rule of law, it becomes more complicated because there is rule of law, because somebody come and challenge it in the court of law. Okay? So, as a result of that, you go out and you acquire 50 acres of land to develop something near the city or close to the city, maybe an industrial park, and you run into this kind of uncertainty. Availability or lack of physical infrastructure, this is the biggest problem all over the world, right? You all know this. Ability or lack of supporting amenities, local market culture and quirks, right? How people use space. The way cities are created, the cities are geographically constrained, and the way people want to build in terms of their culture. Some cultures, if you go to the Arabic culture, right, it used to be very hot, so people used to build like cellular structures, honeycomb cellular structures, where buildings are very close together in order to create streetscape which is shaded, right? So the coming together of buildings with a common streetscape where the walls are high, and the reason why they're packed together is because the high walls packed together create the shade in between. So there is this whole structure of cities that has evolved, right? Now, and that's from there, now they're trying to create souks and other marketplace structures where you will see they're trying to replicate the same grammar of urban form that is culturally been abundant with them for a period of time. So you go like a US investor who thinks, we can build something in the United States like New York, like in, let's say, Fez in Morocco. Really may not be able to do it. Right? Capital formation. You all said capital formation is mostly created in the West. And when did it all get started? Most of the acceleration in capital formation. When did it all? Any thoughts, ideas, Miles?
When the U.S. began to allow foreign investors to buy treasuries.
Okay. Yes.
The Industrial Revolution.
Okay. You're very young, Miles. That's why you're thinking in more modern times. Yes. In the 15th and the 16th century, 16th century where most of the technological innovation started to happen in Europe, right? Before the 16th century, the whole world economy was completely different. There were two predominant powers, economic powers in the world, India and China. They had 72 to 75% of the world's GDP. But they were not able to sustain technological innovation, and a lot of the knowledge that came from the Arab world and from the Indian world and the Chinese world, it all went to found its expression in creative expression, innovation, technological innovation, started to in Europe, right? So, and as a result of that, when technological expansion happens, and you start saying, you know what, we got to have some kind of a market system because there is a marketplace and demand for it. You can sell it in Europe, but the thing about capital structure is that it has to expand beyond Europe. It has to find new markets to expand. And as a result of that, what came about was the colonial enterprise, starting in 1492, right? 1492 up until 1947, the world colonized, and the economic argument for colonization was the factors of production have to be cheap, right? You got to go to places where the natural resources are cheap. You get those natural resources, you bring it to the core, which is essentially parts of Europe, which can manufacture it more efficiently. Rings a bell nowadays, very similar, right? So we manufacture it here, and we really cannot control the factor of production unless there is also, it's associated with political control. And as a result of that, there was a lot of damage in the colonized world, right? Now, and then after 1947, when the world dynamic started to change, then we have seen the world that has emerged now, and the world dynamic started to change, especially in the context of the Second World War, after the Second World War, right? Because then you could not really have an argument when you are fighting the Nazis. You can't have an argument that there is going to be, we cannot have a liberal world where countries go back to their own way of governing their own economies. So after between the two wars, 1914 and 1918, and and the Second World War when it ended in 1945, there was a complete decimation of the European economy. There was no European economy in 44-45. The engine of Europe, Germany, was completely burnt. Right? Germany has been the major industrial manufacturing power center of the world. Okay. So what happened was, we'll come back to this discussion. I'll come back to the whole way how Germany worked and how that flows into how capital formation works and pricing of capital. I'll come back to that later. But in the modern context, the global supply and demand conditions of capital, they establish real interest rates. What is real interest rate?
Adjusted for inflation.
Yes, adjusted for inflation. So what is the fundamental difference between nominal interest rate? What is the rate that the Federal Reserve sets?
Nominal.
Okay. So you adjust that inflation, you get a real inflation. I mean real rate. What is the fundamental difference between real rates and nominal rates? Aside from inflation. If you have inflation and inflation varies by geography or economic components, then the number of economic components you have, the as many number of nominal interest rates you can have. What about real interest rates? There is only one real interest rate in the world, and it is extracted from the nominal interest rates. The real interest rate is what? It is the price of capital, real capital. And what is real capital? If you combine all the capital, the demand and the supply of capital, the net pricing of that, and this is around the world, not just in any specific geography, around the world, when you do that, that's what your real capital, real interest rate is. And then you go back and you differentiate by the level of inflation in different economies. That gives you your, what we call our nominal interest rates, okay? So, now, real interest rates are important because they indicate to you large macro shifts in the economy, macro shifts in the price of capital, availability of capital, and the supply of capital. In this quadrant, expected return on capital for real estate is determined, as we saw. You know, when you invest in real estate, you have some kind of an expected return, right? And we know in real estate there are how many ways to make money? 3. What, Nate?
Your income return.
Income return.
Appreciation.
Capital appreciation.
Tax benefit.
Yes. Plus tax benefits. There is no other way to make money in real estate. There has to be some one of these 3 components. Okay. Now, this gets translated. This is the income return, which you call your cap rate. This is your capital growth, and tax benefits. If you can ignore it, you know, this doesn't apply to many other industries, but in real estate it does apply because you get the big what? What is the tax benefit of this consequence? The depreciation tax benefit, right? A part of which you have to pay back in terms of depreciation recapture tax eventually. Okay. So now you can also think about this as this. Expected return is also some number plus some number. Right? If I give you $100 million or $500 million to invest, and you're thinking of investing across the world, you have all the freedom and flexibility, but your expertise is real estate, and you have to invest in some geography in terms of real estate. What could you do with the money? What's the first thing you could do with the money?
Like treasuries.
Buy treasuries. So you buy treasuries, you mean put it in some kind of a safe place where you can get some money out of it, right? Some
Risk-free,
return.
yeah.
Yes. So what we call is risk-free. Very good. Right? And then you get some, what is this?
Risk premium.
Risk premium. Very good. Now, how do you measure risk premium? What are the ways to measure risk premium? It means risk premium, right? What does premium mean? Premium over what?
It's a spread over your risk-free rate.
Spread over your risk-free rate. Okay. So risk premium is basically risk-free, some return minus the risk-free rate, right? So this is the risk premium. If you okay. What else?
We should add the coefficient.
Some coefficient. What is the logic of having a coefficient? Yes, Miles?
Historical data.
Historical data. You were saying that same thing? So you?
Correlation with the market risk.
Sorry?
Correlation with the market.
Correlation with the market risk. Well, here we said risk premium. This risk premium can have a whole bunch of things, right? One could be the risk premium related to the premium over market plus some delta, and this risk premium includes both of them, right? So, so basically what we are saying is there is some relationship, and that is risk premium, between you at least take your money, put it in a risk-free asset, and then you make some additional, there are some additional factors which can contribute to R2 minus RF, or maybe R, it doesn't have to be RF, or I'll explain what this means. Okay. The challenge has always been in finance to figure out a way to establish what kind of an expected return you would make from any investment. Everybody is comfortable with the fact that wherever you invest, you should at least have some risk-free return where you can park. You can take your money to the bank account or to the US Treasuries and you can park it there, right? But the rest of the risk premium above this has to come from where? Has to come from information that is, you have to find a rational way to extract that information to come to this number, okay? That should ideally tell you what expected return you have. It becomes this is called what? Is the capital asset pricing model, right? Now this is relatively simple and easy in the United States because that's what we have dealt with. Now the question is, how does this change in an international context? And let me ask you a simple question. Assuming I give you $100 million to invest in Brazil. How would you think about what your expected return should be? Expected return means risk-adjusted expected return, right? Yes.
You have to deal with cross-rate exchange, so you're converting your US dollars.
For exchange rate, let's keep the exchange rate out of this, right? And we'll layer back exchange rate on top. Yes, Carter?
I think about country risk, and as in whether it's part of the risk premium add-on.
Okay, so then one of this could be probably country risk, right? Yes, Kevin?
Well, just as a starting point, your risk-free rate in Brazil is different than the U.S. risk-free rate, so you have to start with that.
Which one? Which risk-free rate to pick? And how do you think of country risk in context of the risk-free rate that you have? Right, think about, so let us say I give you $100 million US and you got to invest in Brazil, okay? What kind of questions will you ask? In terms of what kind of return you should expect to get? Would you use the risk-free rate in the United States or in Brazil? How many of you say United States? How many of you say Brazil? Okay, so United States, why?
Because my money is in the United States right now, and I have the option to keep it here. So I mean, it doesn't. At the end of the day, does it really matter? Because if you use the U.S. risk-free rate, you're just going to have a larger risk premium. They can use the Brazil risk-free rate or the small risk rate.
It depends, yes. Yes, conceptually you are correct. What is your issue with this? Not why? What? Some of those of you who prefer using the Brazilian risk-free rate, what's your logic? You raised your hand, Mr. Shi.
This would invest all the money in the Brazil market. It's not really relevant to the US market.
Yes.
Or essentially being like compared to the Brazil market,
Right? If your money, $100 million, is ultimately going to be deployed in Brazil, then what should matter to you is your risk-free rate in Brazil. You put your fund together to invest in the Brazilian real estate, like Heinz did. Okay? They got to park this money somewhere. They could park. Their first line of defense is obviously keep the money in the United States. You will have some risk-free return. Right? But the moment you convert the money and the money goes into Brazil, then your expectation should be what? You're setting your own expectation. Your own expectation is how much money should I be earning even to take this risk in the first place? Yes, Nate.
How do you pick the risk-free rate in all these different markets though? When, in the US it's easy, you're picking the US treasuries, which have never defaulted, but theoretically if you're investing in Greece a number of years ago, you would have thought maybe to use bonds and then they default on it. So what's the, I don't necessarily trust a Brazilian bond or a bond from somewhere else. I don't know which country.
Sure. Wonderful question. So how are those rates even risk-free in the first place?
Aren't they usually priced accordingly?
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, a 10-year bond in Brazil is probably paying you a lot more than the West 10-year bond.
Which bond in Brazil will pay you a lot more?
I
Let
mean-
us say the Brazilian government has, like United States government, when it issues a risk-free security or what is considered to be a risk-free security, is issued in US dollars, typically, right? If the Brazilian government issues a bond in US dollars, which is backed by which is considered an obligation of the Brazilian government, what does that mean in terms of returns? Would you expect the Brazilian government to give you a lower return or a higher return if the Brazilian government issues its bonds in the US dollar?
Lower.
Who says higher? How many of you say higher? How many of you say lower? Okay, why Anmol?
I would think lower because if they're depending on the US, if they're using the dollar, then they're probably lower for them.
So there is a Brazilian bond, with two paths. One is US dollar bond, and the other is Brazilian real bond, right? Let us say US rates, US is how much? Let's say 2%. US risk-free rate is 2%. How much would a Brazilian bond denominated in US dollars? What can you expect on this? How much? Pick some number. 3%. Okay. Let us say 3%. What would you expect here? Yes. 6%. Something a lot higher. And why is that?
A lot more currency risk.
Yes, Mats?
It always depends.
Kevin? Okay. Yes, because when the Brazilian government is issuing a bond in US dollars, it is taking the currency risk and keeping it with itself. You as an investor, when you invest in this bond, you don't have to take the currency risk of US dollar relative to the Brazilian bond, Brazilian real, right? But in this case, Brazilian government has issued this bond in Brazilian reals. When they're paying you 6%, So effectively, how much are you being compensated for your currency risk? 4? Okay. So the difference between this is 3, right? So the compensation for the FX risk is 3%. But what is that 1%? The difference between year and year? It is the country risk. That 1% difference between this is your delta is country risk, incremental country risk. And this, the difference between these two, is your incremental FX risk. Okay? Now, this becomes even more interesting because many countries do not have information about some of these parameters. Some countries don't have, US dollars bonds traded. Some countries don't have domestic currency bonds which are traded. So if you are an investor, you're trying to form a view of what expected return I should have, it becomes very, very, very complicated. And think about this, Brazil is a big country, right? Chances for you to find this data from Brazil is a lot higher relative to, let us say, for example, we don't have Nashua in the class, but Madagascar, for example. You know Nashua, Hassan Ali? Anybody does? Nobody does? Okay. So, okay. We come back. What is risk-free? Even in the US, those of you in corporate finance must have remembered. Is the US risk-free? What is risk-free? What makes a country's bond risk-free?
Credit rating.
Yes, Kevin?
Credit rating.
Credit rating. Okay, but is there any risk-free bond in this world? No?
You get pretty
No?
close.
So why do we call US Treasury risk-free?
As risk-free as it gets.
So that should be risk-free. What if it is as risk-free as it gets? That has to be risk-free. And this leads to the question: what is risk-free? What should be risk-free? Yes, Mr. Shi.
There's no chance to lose money.
There is no chance to lose money. Why? How do you lose money? That's a good answer. So let's go to the next level. What are the things that make you lose money?
If the rate is not above inflation.
So inflation causes the loss of the value of money, right? So anything which has to be risk-free has to be compensating you for the inflation risk you are taking. Right? What else? What makes it risk-free? What are the risks when you buy a bond?
Default.
Sorry?
Default. Whatever's backing it.
Default risk, yes. So first is default risk. Default risk, which is the credit risk. Okay. Now, the US can default? Yes? No? Has the US ever defaulted? Yes? Who says no? Who says yes? When?
Didn't it happen a couple times?
Yes, early 1900s.
Long time ago though.
Sorry?
It's a long time ago though.
Yeah, well, the default is also its own magical way of thinking about default. But default risk is mostly credit risk, right? The second that was pointed out to us was inflation risk. going back to the default risk, if the US cannot, why cannot the US default?
Say, keep printing.
Say that?
They can keep printing more money.
They can print more money. When somebody prints more money, what does it create? Inflation, right? So US may not be in a situation to default here because it can print money, which could lead to an increased inflation risk. Any country in the world that can print its own money can technically not default, but still countries default. Yes, Miles.
You also still have tips as well, treasury inflation. Yeah.
We'll come back to that. So, what happened in Greece, Alex? Do you remember? The Greek economy, a few years ago, there was a big problem, right? Anybody else from Europe, or it's I only have? Okay.
It owed Germany a hell of a lot of money and couldn't pay back.
Yes. There is a fascinating book written by the Greek finance minister. It's quite a character. He became the Greek prime minister during these turmoil times. Victor.
Giannopoulos or something?
Markopoulos or something. It has to be some Polis. It's a common name, no? So, there fascinatingly he writes, Schäuble was the German finance minister. And this entire European Union project came about. Why? Well, we had the Euro in 2000, European Union came about, right? Yes, Victor?
To facilitate trade, eliminate tariffs, that's one of the reasons.
What used to happen before the European common currency?
Trade barriers.
Yeah, well, there were trade barriers, and even if there was trade, every country had its own currency. So any time you were to exchange goods or commodities, you had to transact in the currency, which added on more costs, right? And Europe has had this experience of the 1940s, which plays into the big political economic picture. The French are good administrators. The Germans are the most powerful manufacturers, right? So, yes?
Well, wasn't Greece upset that because they had to adopt the euro, they were not competitive at all anymore with any of their exports?
Not just the Greece, ask the Italians,
All of Southern
ask the
Europe.
Spaniards.
Yeah.
Yes.
The problem is if you have your own fiscal policy but not your own monetary policy, and so you can't change your interest rate, and you're basically your currency is too high to stay competitive within the market.
Yes. So you use a couple of things, like the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. What is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is how you manage your budget, how a country manages its budget. So when the European Union came about, it was stipulated that no country can have more than 3% of current deficit. Current account deficit cannot be more than 3%. Did you know that? Now, if you want to restrict the amount of credit, the current account deficit, that means relative to your current obligations, your obligations cannot be more than 3% of your total assets, current assets. So that puts some limit on growth. Because you can't go out and borrow. You cannot expand your borrowing in order to grow. Right? So that was one constraint. And that constraint was put into place because the Dutch and the Germans were basically, their position was, if we are having one economic union or one currency union, then you can get out of the limitations imposed by maintaining the value of that currency by borrowing more and having your current account deficits expand and inflate all of a sudden, right? They didn't want to have that way out. And most of this came about because the German experience after the First World War, which was hyperinflation experience. If there are countries which are prolific borrowers, you have to limit their borrowing in some form of fashion in order to maintain the stability of the currency. That was the whole idea, right? And if you ask this Greek finance minister, what the problem was, did Germany benefit from the European common currency, from the euro? Yes. Why? How so?
Because it became cheaper for everyone else to buy products.
Yes. Germany benefited because exactly for the reason that everybody had the same currency and they could buy with minimum transaction cost, right? It gave this impetus that okay, this was a big project that Europe will never go to war again. We have the French administrative setup, which is good administration. It's a French administrative project and the German manufacturing project, industrial project, combining come together to the euro. But in order for a currency to work, you've got to have what? True political union. And Europe is culturally different. There are examples like Europe. One country especially is similar to Europe in a lot of ways. Relatively new country. US, yes, it's a new country, but US is older, as surprising as it sounds. US is quite old, 276 years old, no? 250 years old. India is also a very federal structure where the different states can also go out and borrow different stuff. And the same structure is in the United States. But United States financial markets have developed over a period of time. India got its independence in 1947. Most of the financial liberalization took place in 1990. So they have problems like this where the economic growth, how to sustain economic growth across the 29 different states you have, how to limit borrowing by the states. But that's a whole different topic of conversation. Okay. So the other countries like Greek, they benefited from one currency. Why? Because they got pulled in with Germany and Netherlands and France, right? So all these guys, anybody from Greece here? No? Okay. So, how the Greeks are, like, enjoy partying, it's good thing to party, right? Especially if you're gifted with so much sunlight and ocean and beaches, which is all good. So now it became easier for countries whose cost of borrowing would have been higher once they became part of this euro. They benefited because now they were receiving borrowing at a much cheaper cost. So what did they do when you get that? You borrow. You borrow more. In the hope that at some point the center of the European project will come together and bail you out. And when the crisis hit, some of the Greek banks were on the verge of default. The Greek government was on the verge of default. And I don't know if you remember the stories. There is one corporate entity which is present every time there is a problem in the world. Can you name one?
Goldman Sachs.
Yes. Yes. Goldman were there in Italy, in Greece also. They had camouflaged the country's borrowing. They sold a financial product, said we will mask your borrowing. And when the whole thing came out, you got to again, there cannot be a major scandal in the world without Goldman Sachs. So the Greek were borrowing more and they were hiding it, and it came about. And then when it came down to paying down Greek debt, there was nobody to pay it down. The Germans said we won't do it. Walter Schäuble, who's the finance minister, right? He met with the Greek prime minister, and the Greek prime minister, he was the finance minister then. He went out and he said, you know what, you have to help us. We helped you after 1945. The Marshall Law, Marshall Project,
Marshall Plan, yeah.
Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan. So after, when the Marshall Plan was put in place, between the First War and the Second War also, the problem was Germany was so indebted for reparation payment that it could not sustain itself. Then the Greek finance minister reminds the German finance minister that we helped you reduce your borrowing at that time, so you help us now. So the German finance minister says, and I'm not talking, it's a book saying, how can we forgive any debt for the communists? They want to borrow, but they don't want to pay. Yeah. So that story is still unfolding. Right? So, but would Germany, if Euro was 100% supported by Germany, would it be risk-free? Most likely risk-free. I would consider the Euro to be more risk-free than the US dollar. Because they have this huge anathema. They don't want to print more money too much, except to restore growth. And they're having some difficulty restoring growth, obviously, with the slowdown and the trade figure. But, so any country which can print its money cannot default, technically. If they were to print money, it is called default by other means. You can default on your debt by returning the money back and by inflating your debt, inflating your currency. Because now what you're paying, when you borrowed money and you're returning the payments on your bond, and if that has depreciated in value because of inflation, you're effectively defaulting it by other means, right? And what is the third? In order to make something risk-free, what is the third? Yes.
Interest rate risk?
Yes. Interest rate risk. It's also called reinvestment risk. What is reinvestment risk?
If yields go up, your bond is worth less.
Why?
Well, because if you try to sell it, you'll sell it at a lower number than you bought it for.
Okay, so your holding value decreases, but you are supposed to hold it to maturity. Let's say 10-year bond, you hold it to maturity. You are right, but there is a slightly more nuanced way to think about it, which is, yes, Martin.
The coupons that come off of the bond, reinvesting those, and it doesn't mean like yields go down and you're not able to recoup as much as you had anticipated.
Yes. When you invest in a bond, and let's say this is your Brazilian bond, you pay a price for the Brazilian bond, and you pay your first coupon 1 plus the return that you would expect, plus let us say it's an annual bond. Right? This is no rocket science. This is time value of money, basically. Your cash flow divided by one the discount factor, and so on and so forth, gives you what. So if you have a stream of a bond cash flow stream, you should be getting paid this, right? So if the interest rate goes up, R goes up, what happens to the price of the bond?
Yeah.
Goes down. That's what you were saying. right? Now, so, but you hold the value of the bond. You hold the bond. If you hold it to maturity, how much are you going to get when the bond matures?
Face value.
The face value. Exactly right. Face value is what? The $1,000 that you bought the bond for, right? So you will get that. So over maturity, there will be only one difference between that scenario, and that would be related to this. If your interest rates goes down, then the coupon you will invest will yield you less, right? Let me ask this. What does this look like? This looks like your IRR kind of thing, net present value if you want to call it. Yes? Do you remember? Cyrus? This is your IRR, right? How come? C1, 1 plus R to the power 1, right? And this is your what? Present value of your cash flows. This is your investment amount, the money you paid to buy this bond. The net of the two is your net present value, right? So you can write this equation like this also. Now, this is how much you paid, this is how much you got, and if the NPV of this is 0, that means what is the IRR? This R is the IRR, right? So now let's go back to the concept of IRR. We will deal with it in the capstone again. IRR means the net that discount rate at which the net present value is 0. Now, the implied assumption underlying IRR is what? When you calculate IRR, does anyone remember? This is real estate finance 1. What is the implied assumption underlying IRR? Yes, Miles.
I think how to say this. So let's say we have the last year 10 is when you get all of your cash back, coupon, all that. They're saying that by year 9, right, your coupon, you're actually reinvesting that at the same rate, and that, I guess that's the way it's backing out of it. So your year 1 is actually compounding 9 times until you get to your 10.
Yes. Yes, the underlying assumption is that any money that you receive from period to period during your holding period gets reinvested at your
current IRR.
At your IRR that you calculated here, which is R, right? So that was your assumption. Now, when you bought this bond, you had a certain IRR you invested to. Now, if the rates go down, in reality what happens, you cannot really reinvest that coupon at the rate that you thought you would invest. You can only invest at the rate which is prevalent at that time, or perhaps you take that money and put it again in a risk-free amount, right? So your returns could be substantively less, and that is your interest rate risk. Interest rate risk arises from the reinvestment differential arising from the difference in your expected IRR relative to your actual IRR.
Modify that.
No.
No?
Modified IRR. No, let's not confuse that. But you're hold that thought.
Sorry, I just have a question.
Yeah.
In the normal real estate investment, when you calculate the IRR, you're not assuming you're reinvesting in the deal.
You are.
You use IRR.
If you use IRR, you are. That's how the IRR calculation is done. We'll come back to that. We'll discuss, why does that surprise you though?
Is it?
What is IRR calculation? Maybe we go back, right? IRR is this. You invest some amount of money,
Right.
and you get your cash flows. Let's say you you invest and bought a property,
Yeah.
income producing property, you got some cash flow in, let's say, 10 years. And in the 10th year, when you sold the property, you got the operating cash flow, plus you also got the value of the sale price of the property, right? and then you calculated your IRR, that R. What does that IRR include? That includes the reinvestment of the income that you get from period to period. That is why it is called internal in the first place, IRR. IRR is internal rate of return. Internal means the money stays internal to the system, it doesn't go up.
Yeah, but in real life, you're not putting the money back.
Now, real life is different. That's what Miles was saying. And I didn't want to go into the conversation.
Okay.
That's what Miles was saying. What Miles was saying was, exactly as you said, in real life, let's say your IRR, you're like, you're very happy you're making an investment. And you, especially if you're making an international investment, you run your IRR and it comes down to 50%. You start jumping 5 feet into the air. Right? What is the problem with this?
Can't reinvest at that rate.
Yes, almost impossible to reinvest all your income that you're getting from period to period at the 50%. Right? Anytime your IRR is more than 18 to 20%, put it in the garbage. Now, there are ways you can actually incorporate those things, the practical things, like, if you reinvest, you can get 50%, but you can get some number. Maybe risk-free rate. You want to take this money and put it in risk-free rate. How can you adjust for the actual reinvestment rate that you have? That is called, what he was saying was modified IRR calculation. And we will, through this course, we will do it, and we'll also do it in the capstone. Yes.
So I promise I won't bother you anymore after this. In all of our underwriting models, we're using XIRR.
Yeah, XIRR is different thing. XIRR is closer to IRR. The underlying principle between XIRR and IRR is the same. XIRR and IRR, the only difference is you incorporate the timing.
It's not, yeah. But it's still correct. The number I'm getting is correct, even though the money's not going back in. Into the property.
Say that again. No, IRR calculation, there is nothing wrong with it. But if you understand the underlying assumptions on which IRR works, and if your IRR number is too high, then IRR doesn't work. Okay? Yes.
The best, the way I think about it is if your standard rate of return is, let's say, for a fund, is like 7%, and you're getting 50%, you want to have your MIRR as 7% reinvestment rate. That's what your norm is. So then it'll adjust it.
We'll walk you through how to adjust it. We'll do all that exercise as part of this, don't worry. So now, risk-free rate, default risk, inflation rate, and reinvestment risk. 3 kinds of risk. Now, when you're looking at a risk-free rate of a country, you got to explore all these. This default risk, if they have a sovereign debt, they have a sovereign borrowing, and the debt is trading in the marketplace, and it's like a local currency, domestic currency dominated bond, and it's yielding 6%, then you know the default risk is what? Default risk is that number by which the 6% is higher than their domestic risk-free rate. And if this is the risk-free security, then it is the 6%. Okay? So that is this. Should you be compensated for all 3? Yes. You should be compensated for the default risk, and your challenge would be to extract what the default risk should be based on the information that is available. You should also be compensated for the inflation risk. The combination of these two should compensate you for the domestic borrowing, domestic risk-free rate. And this reinvestment risk is a whole different animal. What we can do is we can construct a security which takes out the reinvestment risk. What is the security that has no reinvestment risk? Anyone? Yes, Carter?
Zero coupon bond.
Zero coupon bond. Any security that promises you to give you some face value here and there will be no coupons in the middle, has by definition no reinvestment risk. Okay? How can you get compensated for inflation risk? You have in the United States Treasury inflation protected miles,
Yeah, tips.
TIPS, Treasury inflation protected securities. So this. So now, if you are thinking about what is a pure risk-free security for the United States, what would that be? You know, I know you know. What is the absolute risk-free security benchmark for the United States? The TIPS security, which is also a zero coupon bond and issued by the US government. That is an ideal risk-free security. Now, this doesn't really matter too much recently for us. Why doesn't it matter? Because inflation has not existed. Inflation has been taken out into our system. So your old generation is like living, you're born with a silver spoon. But that was not always the case. Inflation used to be 20% back in late 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And if inflation became a big thing, then you have to account for this. Then your traditional US treasury does not work as a risk-free security at all. Okay? So understanding the components will allow you to think about how to think about just this part first. US context, non-US context, all the three forces will apply here. And this, when you break this down this way, it allows you to understand better this. And then you figure out, okay, if they have a traded security, that's how you deal with it. And let's say it's Madagascar. What will you do for a small country like Madagascar? How do you figure out what the default risk is, inflation risk is, interest rate risk is? Because Madagascar may not have international borrowing. What do you do then? You look at what the bank borrowing rates are. Domestic bank, Madagascar will have a bank borrowing rate. And if they don't, then there are some international banks lending to the local business people, the largest businesses domestically where they're lending, and that will have an interest rate. Right? Hopefully the interest rate is compensating them for inflation also. So you have to extract information from public information that is available. And we will keep coming back to this because there is a lot of this piece also which is left, which we will deal later. Okay. So market valuation of assets drives the valuation and develops potential for flow of capital globally. Okay. And then regulatory risk here. In this quadrant, global capital flow is filtered through this mechanism. Domestic and international capital choices are also established because of if you're going into a high risk market, you have to price it accordingly. You have to identify what the risk parameters are. A lot of the country risk dimension is taken care of at this level. This is the other risk. This risk premium reflecting the risks. All of the risks are established. So we have to identify what this is going to be, the second part. And with respect to this quadrant, the third quadrant, once capital has filtered through the regulatory sieve, it is put to work for new construction and to replace, upgrade existing depreciated assets. And this happens because of, this is affected by things like constraints on supply of land. Many countries you go, you really can't build things. You go to China, and if you have a good project, you go to the government, they will find land for you. At least that used to be the case up until the very recent. Now they have other systems in place. go to Mumbai, there is a constraint on the supply of land. There are title issues. Valuable real estate, valuable land sitting in the heart of cities cannot be tapped into to create new space because of the regulatory structure, because of the policy framework, because of excessive rule of law. Sometimes. And then you have to deal with this thing called replacement cost. When you build something, what is replacement cost is one of the most important benchmarks, right? Are you buying something above or below replacement cost? If you're buying below replacement cost, what does that mean? Yes, your investment is safer. Why is it safer though? Yes, Miles?
The moat, like a barrier to entry.
Yes. Yes. Barrier to entry of what kind?
New supply.
Yes, Carter? Then you.
Someone can't just build the same product.
Yes. Yes. When assets are selling below the replacement cost in the market, it is a deterrent to the supply of new. As long as assets are trading below replacement cost, right, new supply is less likely to come online. That is the reason. That's what you were
That's
saying.
right.
Obviously, inflation. Inflation can have devastating impact across the world. Your generation hasn't seen inflation. You know? Ask the Zimbabweans.
In the US, yeah.
Sorry?
In the US, we haven't seen it.
We haven't seen since when? Since the late 80s. Ask the Zimbabweans. Ask the Thai and the Malaysians in 1997, 98. Ask Venezuelans today. Right? Very, very big. It's, if you have a social safety net in place and you can use food vouchers, you can go, that's a whole different dynamic. But if you have no social safety net, there is no developed system of food vouchers, and you're working in the fields and you earn $10 a day, by the evening you need $15 to feed your family, you have no money, inflation becomes real. It's a whole, inflation is, we don't feel inflation for many reasons, which again we will come back to. Regulatory zoning entitlement issues can be an obstruction to provision of new space. Competition. You thought, well, I got $100 million, I went to Shack and I can go and I can build in. We take India. I can say as many bad things to India because I have a right to. The local competition will always have more asymmetric information than you. The mindset is so fierce because they are there protecting their own investment territory. There was this, maybe I've given some example before, but there was this company called Vodafone? Have you heard of Vodafone? Right? The telecom company, started by very smart people apparently. They went to India, so there was this big announcement in India, Vodafone is coming to India. India had its own telecom companies, private sector held companies. And I was coming out of the Mumbai airport. I see a huge sign up there, little billboard. Vodafone's brand name that was coming to India was called Orange. Orange was their brand. Okay? So, and they have announced, and all the Indian domestic players are, saying, oh, there's this foreign company coming. Good. Not so good. Who knows? But then they put the billboard which captures their sentiment in the most effective way. And let me describe how it is. They have a juicer. They have an orange which has been peeled, and there is some orange juice on the bottom of the billboard. And it says, welcome orange. That's the mindset. They understand how the rule of law operates there. They understand the asymmetries. They understand legal issues. They understand how to move around capital. They understand the entitlement issues, the construction risks. They understand everything. Right? So for you to go like Heinz is to deploy everything into this in order to control. The moment you lose control, this is a problem. And when we discuss Heinz in detail, we'll focus more on this. Constraints on construction. There is a little reference to this in Heinz. In the case study that you all studied, there is this reference to the local laws not allowing international standards of construction. Yes, Miles?
Yeah, this will be the fire alarm.
The fire alarm
yeah.
system, sprinkler fire alarm system. Okay? Now, how do you get to know this? You have to understand, you have to be embedded in the market. That's the reason why Heinz is exploding. That's the reason why Baupost will go into that market. That's the reason why Equity International will go into the market. That is the reason why a whole set of cases we will do, will explore those areas. Now, what's happening in terms of urbanization, right? In 2007, there were considered to be 1.5 billion people. This was from a McKinsey study. 22% of the global population. By 2025, which is 5-6 years from now, 2.5 billion people will be living in cities. 25% of the global population. This is a huge migration from the rural to the urban, which we don't feel here. China has moved 800 million people from the rural areas to the urban areas. Since 1978, when Deng Xiaoping started the Great Reform. 30 trillion of GDP, more than half of the global GDP. Here, 60% of the global GDP. So it is not just the demographic shift, it is the buying power, the consumption shift that is also happening to urban areas. This is the greatest time to be born and alive as a real estate guy. Think about it. GDP. They cut this data of 600 cities, of which 23 were the mega cities. Mega cities they have defined as population more than 10 million. And middleweight cities, 577 middleweight cities as part of their sample. Middleweights are 150,000 to 10 million population. In 2007, of the 23 mega cities, 7 were in developed countries, 16 were in developing countries. And of the 577 middleweight, 170 were in developed countries and 407 were in developing countries. Today, major urban areas in developed regions are without doubt economic giants. Most of you think about this, right? New York, Boston, Baltimore, this entire, where there is a convergence towards regional expansion. Our notion of city is also expanding as more urbanization takes place. And we are almost at the peak of our urbanization in the West. 380 developed region cities in the top 600 urban centers by GDP accounted for 50% of the global GDP. The 220 largest cities in developing regions contributed another 10%. Okay? And this was the expected growth, urban GDP growth. 31.2% of the share of the total growth in the United States. In fact, in terms of the, if you just factor in not China's 9% growth, but the 6% growth that is happening now, China still needs a city of the space in terms of the size of a city of the size of Chicago every year. That is the demand for if the growth continues even at 6%. And obviously Brazil, Mexico, and so on and so forth. Now, these are the 600 top cities. Right? And these are the light blue ones are the additional cities in their sample. The total sample size was 1,400 cities. Now, the urban clout or the dynamic of urbanization is shifting towards the east. There is no doubt about it. Because of economic growth, if you look at these were the world's top 50 cities ranked by GDP in 2007 and 2025. By 2025, if you see the pattern here, the green ones are the ones that are still apart in 2025. The hollow ones are the ones that will drop out of the top 50 cities. Right? And the new ones, the dark green ones, are the ones that are emerging here. And this tells you the entire story of urbanization. So on, we can look at these slides. And it is inevitable that the global urbanization story also follows the global GDP growth. After 2008, our economy here in the United States shrunk. Europe shrunk more. The Indian economy grew twice in that period after 2008, and almost twice did the Chinese economy. Okay? So, look at this. I want to go into give you some other examples. If you look at top performing middleweights outperform most of the mega cities in terms of household growth. It's not just the linear spatial dimension that is important, but actually the people who live, the size of the family, the disposable incomes they have. All those are metrics that are important from a real estate and analysis perspective when you're considering investing in a market. Okay. Look at what's happening. The topmost cities: Beijing, Shanghai, Tokyo, Chongqing, Mumbai, and so on and so forth. Top 25 hotspots by 2025 in terms of GDP. Overall GDP, New York, Tokyo, the big cities will retain their place mostly. Per capita GDP, Oslo, any Norwegians here? I think this will change because, the Norwegians have not really managed their sovereign wealth fund that well. But they are resource rich, very resource rich, and so on. GDP growth, here the story becomes different. Shanghai, Beijing, Tianjin, Chongqing, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Nanjing, I'm improving my Chinese, my Mandarin. Total population. Children, because these children will grow up into people who will spend, hopefully. Right? Population growth. Households, number of households. Income over $20,000 US. So there are some new entrants here. And keep going. Commercial floor space required. Laundry care products. Young entry-level consumers. Lagos. Has anyone been to Lagos? You've been to Lagos, Warren?
Nigeria? Yeah.
Sorry?
Nigeria?
Nigeria, yeah. You've traveled 148 countries.
Three.
143 countries. Well, give him a round of applause for it. Good for you. Laundry. So, you would have seen so many young people in Lagos living in a lot of poverty, but the demographic there. The question is whether the country can reap the demographic dividend. Many countries have the demography, but they don't have the ability to reap and benefit from it. Okay. Now, this basically tells you that per capita GDP has generally rises in tandem with urbanization. If you look at most of the highest GDP countries have the highest amount of urban population. if by this benchmark you try to move these two countries and some of the other smaller countries who are here up this level, the demand of space is going to be significantly higher than where it is today. Urban residential floor space per capita. If you think about this is United States and Canada, line to line, right? China. The red is the China region, right? This has to shift from here and become closer, make this gap closer here, and so on and so forth. I'm going to skip some of these, and you can take a look. These slides are posted for you all. What is this? In terms of demand for new dwellings, will increase dramatically in some major cities. Sao Paulo there is a expectation of demand increase of 56% in urban dwellings, 50% in Mexico City, 95% in Bogota. Chinese cities alone are expected to contribute nearly 40% of the global growth in residential and commercial floor space demand in 2025. And as we study the China case, we will see how fundamentally different their approach has been to capital formation. We have different models arising in the world. On the monetary side, the model between the United States and Europe. On the natural capital base, the difference between the developed world, the Western world, and the Chinese model, right? Very different. We'll study that. We talked about clusters, right? So the Chinese economic strategy, urbanization strategy, is centered around clusters. The clusters of activity around certain common industrial groups. Mega cluster example is Jingjinji, 37 cities. Did I say that right? Yeah. They have one hub city and they have cluster cities around it. And look at the entire east coast of China. Think about India. India's own strategy is around, they're not so urbanized. India is perhaps one of the least urbanized major countries in the world. So, and that, you must have noticed that, Warren, right? Your travels?
Yeah, we drove from Delhi to Agra, and it's just, agriculture as far as you can see.
Yes, still very agricultural. But what they're doing is they're constructing what they call economic corridors, right? From Delhi to Mumbai, and they have a corridor here, they have an economic corridor here, they have economic. So it's called the quadrilateral. And they're tying the quadrilateral to the industrial heart belt of India, heart center of India. Right? These global partnerships are developing these corridors. This is the automation, rich car manufacturing. This is all other industrial activity. This is more like industrial natural resources side of the country. Right? So this is being built in coordination, the Japanese and the Indian joint venture. This entire corridor linking Delhi and all the cities around it all the way to Mumbai. And from Mumbai it gets into the port. I gave you an example of, there is this guy called Parag Khanna. Have you heard of Parag Khanna? He wrote a book, actually several books. More recent one is called The Asian Century. But there is another book before that he wrote, it is called okay, we'll come back to that. So his argument is this. As a city, New York City may have less in common with Denver than Shanghai because of interconnectivity between Shanghai and New York. So he says cities by itself do not mean too much in the emerging landscape going forward. What matters is how interconnected four cities are. And as a result of expansion, you can see large regionals, mega regions emerging. There's 7 mega regions within the United States. And then you have this big initiative. Have you heard of the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah.
Yeah? Who has not heard of the Belt and Road Initiative? It's called One Belt, One Road Initiative. This is the pet project of Xi Jinping, right? And the idea is as follows, that in the old days there used to be the Silk Road, the Great Silk Road that used to pass through and connect different cities across in Asia. Okay? And they want to reconstruct that Silk Road and the cities along that Silk Road. Right? And effectively connect China all the way to the heart of Europe and all those different places. Now, you know, how much money this is going to consume to build this? Something to the magnitude of $20 trillion. And the idea is to take the whole concept of caravans, when in the old days, you know, people used to trade and move from one place to the other, and try to construct and bring cities together in this way they can. This is also very controversial. Can somebody say why this one belt and one road is controversial? Yes.
A lot of it, well, I think multiple reasons. One is that a lot of it involves alleged predatory lending by the Chinese. So they'll lend money to a lot of these countries that they're trying to expand to. And then when the countries can't pay it back, they'll get like a concession on the land or something else in return. Also, they're expanding their military along this path, and they're starting to develop, I guess, foreign naval and air bases around these regions as well.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes, Nate?
Also, kind of adding on to that, part of it's about the economic benefits for them, but it's also political control, which relates to these loans. And then the second thing was I've heard that they're using Chinese workers everywhere, so a lot of these promised local benefits don't actually materialize because they're bringing Chinese construction companies, Chinese workers, making the loans to the local governments, who are then basically funneling money back to China. So it's controversial from that point of view.
That is controversial. That is for sure controversial. Although there has been more recent positive changes. This has big geopolitical implications, right? Geopolitical implication is we are, you know, while we are in a very good time, we are living in a good time. In the history of the world, there is a professor, his name is Graham Ellison of Harvard Kennedy School. He wrote a book. It's called Thucydides's War or something like that. Thucydides, who was the Greek philosopher, is the idea. Let me tell you what the idea is. In the history of the world, he goes and he maps and says, whenever there has been a rising power and their established power, how has that change happened? Right? He studied and says, what does history tell us? There have been 16 such instances where there was a well-established power and there was an emerging power. Of the 16 times, it is 12 times that it ended up in major conflict. Major conflict. So the challenge of our time is to be able to avoid that conflict, right? Because the cost of conflict is very different now. But obviously, as you can see, right, here, access right into the Strait of Hormuz gets direct access to energy, and which may be good for domestic sectors within China, but the guys here and these guys, they feel not so sure of and then here the emergence of the Indo-Pacific region. And then there is this country called Sri Lanka right here. There was a port called Hambantota. I don't you remember? Do you remember Hambantota? So I think something related to Hambantota was where it was a part of the One Belt, One Road initiative, and there was a port that was constructed with Chinese money. And these guys in poor Sri Lanka, they like partying a lot. What will they do with the port? And so they ended up not being able to pay for the port. and they had to give the port over to China. And that became a huge major controversy. I think that's what you were alluding to, so I'm just expanding upon it. So but now, in the most recent, I think there is awareness within the highest echelons of the Chinese government that there are issues with this. And this will never take off unless there is a more considered way to do that, where people do not feel that it is just a monetary transaction in lieu of control of assets. It has to be something more than that. And I believe until that takes place, and large countries have a responsibility to facilitate and all the other countries, the smaller countries, to feel not so insecure, right? And then they feel comfortable. Financially also, perhaps more diversified financial basings, where there is not just one country that is lending, perhaps a group of countries. And I think that idea has come forth from the Chinese government, that they are open to have a coordinated financing of these projects rather than solely done by the Chinese entity, which is, I think, a positive step. Okay. Look at the cities and the countries that will be impacted by the One Belt, One Road initiative. Basically, most of Europe, most of Central Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, everywhere. It's going to be. This is from the book by Parag Khanna. So for global investors looking to opportunities around the world, it is critical to first understand the macro urban trends, demographic evolution, household trends, income, connectivity, and make it a central part of your due diligence. It's just not you find a site and we will build. Because you could have found the site in different places, tier 1 cities, 2 cities, tier cities, 4 cities. So when you have, first of all, you have to be like, thinking like Heinz, you have to have a strategic way to get into a country. And within the country, how to spot the right kind of a city, where do you want to participate, what are the characteristics and the qualities of that city that allow your investment to be reasonably safe and allow you to expand your business in that marketplace. And not necessarily focus on the mega cities, which are household names. Monitoring new trends in urban logistics, changes in generational preference, driverless transportation, trends, driverless transportation. We may have it in the United States, but I can guarantee you, you can never have driverless transportation in Mumbai. Oprah went to Mumbai, and she said, she drove like for half an hour. She said, I could see God everywhere. She realized that there is God, because if that place can exist in spite of so much uncertainty, with 5 cars coming from different directions, and you still survive, there has to be God. Trends impacting global supply chains. This gets into the realm of trade. Industrial assets are very susceptible to shifts in global supply chains. Right? Who knows what the outcome of the trade discussions is going to be between the United States and China? That could fundamentally alter the trade map of the world, the logistical map of the world. Elimination of constraints on urban growth, infrastructure trends. You go to China, you see certain cities that are better than developed country cities. The train infrastructure, that's most amazing. But that's not always possible to do in every country. And you have to understand why. And also, when it is done in China, you also have to understand what the underlying risks are there for China itself because of the kind of growth that has emerged. What were the sources of that growth and what risk that growth poses? Then we get into capital formation. Long-term real interest rates are set by global capital markets based on global supply and demand of capital. There is real rate is only one globally. Okay? And so how is it set? It is set by balancing the aggregate demand between the savings, which is essentially the supply of capital, and investment, which is the demand of capital, and is reflected in the long-term real interest rates. If you combine there are countries which are consuming capital, which are growing, which have the demographics, which need capital, which have to create an infrastructure base, an industrial base. And they are the developed countries which have accumulated capital, but growth has slowed down because the demographics isn't there anymore. Only major source of growth is going to be innovation. So those countries who have capital and those who need capital, they come together, and that is what creates the global capital flows. Countries that can lend money and countries that need money to borrow for growth brings the global capital flow possible, makes it possible. So as a consequence of that, sovereign countries issue debt to fund the gap between their savings and investment in their market. In an interconnected international financial market world, nations with surplus savings can lend to those who need additional capital over and above the national savings for investment. Since the 1980s, the declining investment in the developed countries, most of our infrastructure was built and finished by when? In the United States? 50s. Most of the highway network was all done by 50s, right? For the past 3 decades, developed economies have shifted away from agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and infrastructure, all of which are capital-intensive industries. The nature of our industrial base has changed. Growth in services and productivity from technology has required less investment and made investments more efficient. Less government borrowing and more privatizations have also been factors. Access to capital has been made more efficient by the growth in the public markets, reducing the cost of capital through things like asset securitization. Right? Think about this. What is asset securitization? I think if this will go down in the history of world's innovations, as one of the greatest innovations, is things like residential mortgage-backed securities. Even commercial, howsoever maligned they are, commercial mortgage-backed securities, credit card-backed securities, auto loans-backed securities. When you are taking an illiquid pool of assets and creating liquidity out of it, you're freeing up capital for further growth. And there is one more thing happening more recently, which is opportunity zones. What is opportunity zone? You have your capital gains tied as illiquid somewhere. You are now able to take it and you can liquefy your capital gains, right? It's not really as simple as that, but it is. The benefits may not be there as much as people have thought from opportunity zones. The deployment of Asian, predominantly Chinese savings to fund consumption, particularly in the US, has also contributed to keeping real interest rates low. Leading into 2008, what happened? Money was very cheap, right? Because we had somehow come up with the idea that we are beyond manufacturing. We can design things and the Chinese will manufacture. The rest of the world will manufacture for us. It doesn't work that way. Why? Can somebody give me one insight? Why is manufacturing so essential to a country? Yes, Miles.
Multiplier effect.
What do you mean multiplier effect?
So if I were to, for every job, there's a manufacturing job that I have in my home country, I guess I then add 3 more jobs, let's say. And those jobs are, the buying and selling of the resources, the gathering of the resources. You have all of those jobs that will probably occur in that home country.
Okay. You're directionally close, but anyone else wants to give it a shot? Why is manufacturing so essential?
Can I also say also isolates your country from trade imbalance? If you're buying a car, if you're creating a car in your home country, you're then not dependent on selling the car elsewhere. So like Germany right now is a prime example. They're getting destroyed. The trade is slowed down. They're trade dependent. Whereas
Yes.
us, we're a little more isolated.
Okay. Let's take the comparison between Brazil and Germany, for example. If you had some money, where would you invest? You are interested in the long-term protection of your money. Where? Here, Germany. Why? And the answer to this question goes to the answer to that question. Why Germany? Why not Brazil? Yes, Nate.
I think Germany's tied into the European Union, and if you look historically, it's obviously in the last 30, 40 years after World War II, it's been a little bit more stable than Brazil has. They're impacted a lot by a bunch of other companies. I think most people would consider stable, and then there's a lot of foreign investment there, which kind of impacts the direction they go. So I think in general, you'd assume it's a bit more of a sure bet, and Brazil would be where the political situation, amongst other things, a lot more uncertain.
Sure. Kevin.
Germany's economy is based off of manufacturing and producing products. Brazil's is extracting natural resources.
So there is some symbiotic relationship between the two, right? The Brazilians have the commodities that they can provide as factors of production for a car to be made either in Germany or in China, right? Is that a problem for Brazil? Brazil is doing well. If the economy grows, the Chinese economy grows 8-9%, they will be able to export a lot. The problem is this: vibrant economic systems are essentially based on the retention of high quality information and know-how. When you are exporting commodity like products without retaining the knowledge that comes and the value add that is added to the commodities, what are you left with? What are you retaining at the end of the day? Saudi Arabia, another example. What have they been doing in the past? Just export oil, our balance sheet goes up. We don't have Salman in this class, but I would have made fun of him. And then you go out and you buy $450 million cruise boats. Right? Or the Mundi, what is the painting that is put in the Abu Dhabi library now. Economic vibrancy and dynamism are only in history have come from not just the bringing together of new knowledge and know-how to do things, but also in the ability to retain that know-how for the benefit of the masses of your region and area. That's what manufacturing does. It prevents the dispersion of information that will have accrued to the benefit of your society. So countries that are more focused on the retention of knowledge, creation of products, utilizing natural resources from all the different parts of the world are likely to be more competitive in the long run. What was the colonial project? At the time of when colonization, I can give the example of India. When the British came to India, Robert Clive came to India in 1498. India was the wealthiest country in the world. And Britain had the technological, and the navy that grew with it. India was manufacturing basically everything in a very sustainable economic network at that time. That's why it was called the Golden Bird. In history, they used to use that word. So, what could the British do? And I'm not saying these are not my thoughts, these are thoughts, well-researched thoughts. Was they could instead of competing against the products domestically, they had to utilize the periphery of the colonial project as the provider of natural resources back to Manchester to create fabrics which are machine driven because there was a technological advantage. And once you start cutting the existing economic networks that are in place, you completely destroy the thing. What is called Bangladesh? Have you heard of Bangladesh, the country of Bangladesh? Bangladesh, that region of the world, was the wealthiest region in the world. When the British came, they had, I love the British, but I'm also a lover of history, you know. When the British came, there was nothing they could export. China was the next big market nearby, and there was nothing they could export until they found a way. You know what they found to export to China? Opium. The opium that was exported from what is today Bangladesh ended up in China. And that because it was a trade, profit-based enterprise. In the process, what happens? Bangladesh, that area, became one of the poorest places in the world today. And you know what happened because of the opium trade in China anyway. Right? So, the challenge for going forward is focus on those countries and those regions and those societies that we are rebuilding their traditional economic networks, albeit in a modern form, because the world has changed. That rebuilding of the network will provide your most antidote against too much risk, where the populations are being educated, where there is a retention of knowledge, there is more manufacturing activity, there is more servicing activity, there is more freedom, and you know, that's the big difference between India and China. The political systems are very different. It's exactly the opposite between India and China. In many ways, India is like the United States. China has its own history of political economy and political administration system. Right? Sometimes the world doesn't understand, but it has its own merit-based system. The Confucian-based merit system. Nothing is wrong with either of those systems. But where do you feel more comfortable? Those larger questions and how those larger questions are being implemented in the social administration of countries should also be another source of information and thought process in your due diligence when you're looking at a marketplace today. It is not just that I can take my money, I can set a legal entity, and I will talk to you through all that, how that is done. But these are the big picture questions, because you want to go and, you have how many, 100 years to live, right? And go back to your homes and take out an Excel and do a calculation. This is how much I'm supposed to live, put in 100 years. And then put in how much you have already lived, and then take a calculation, percent, and then do it 1 minus that percent. You'll be depressed. Really depressed. So you have to live your life efficiently. Find whatever you do full of meaning, right? And meaning can come from the path itself. When let's say you want to really become an international real estate investor, you have to embed yourself into the culture. You have to understand. The first thing should be, as I keep saying, why am I the chosen one? Why have I been chosen to go to that country? Why is that I will not be like the juicer, the orange in the juicer will be spilled all over? Why am I going to be the one who's going to end up like orange? Okay. And be able to understand the macro picture and translate that macro picture, relate it back to demand, and come back and say, this is how I'm going to price. So when you are in your meeting with your investor, you have a 360-degree view of your deep understanding of, it's not just about money. You are investing in a system. And is the system robust enough to further reduce your risk after you have invested? rather than leaving you much more exposed to risk. You went in there because somebody gave you money, and that is inevitably the problem every time you lose money. And we will see some examples through that. Am I over time? Okay. So, because of the convergence in technology and globalization, the spreads between Europe and the United States came down from 40 basis points from 200 basis points. So there has been lots of changes. Equity returns were boosted, valuations of asset became, benefited from lower discount. I'm going to move on. Here is the chart I want to leave you with. Not leave you with, but continue with. So, this is looking at what is likely to happen going forward. Real interest rate is set in the global markets by the global supply and demand of capital. Look at the 1980s. The supply of capital was, let us say, hasn't changed. And your demand for capital, which is very typically very high when there is a larger need for building up infrastructure. And when your infrastructure is built in the 1950s, and it has been most of the capital intensive infrastructure, and by 2008, it has fallen. That led to a decrease in the price of capital. Real rates went really down. And a lot of this went down because there was this guy called Paul Volcker. Have you heard his name, Paul Volcker? Yeah? Alex?
Heard the name.
Okay. So, anybody? Paul Volcker? You know Paul Volcker? What is his claim to fame?
His rule, right?
His what?
Volcker rule.
Volcker rule.
Volcker rule? What is Volcker rule? Paul Volcker was the Federal Reserve chairman when the inflation went up to 20%, 18%. Mr. Volcker came in. He could have let the inflation be the way it is, perhaps brought in some more helicopters with more money. Instead, he chose to take on the job only on the condition that he's going to wring out inflation from our system. And he did that. He did that by increasing interest rates. Interest rates were as high as 18%. Can you imagine doing a real estate deal at 18% interest rate? Impossible, right? So, by raising rates, he's wrung out inflation from a system. As a result of that, from the 80s to 2008, last crisis, interest rates were in the direct decline. And when rates decline, what happens? There's more ability for people to consume, right? Be more innovative, run more businesses more efficiently. And that has been one of the reasons for the long-term prosperity that happened in those 30 years. The question is, 2008 to 2019 today, right? Rates are not substantively different. They're even lower. Question is, what should happen going forward? There are several forces at play. The direction that rates take will have a big implication on the kinds of returns you would expect. You are real estate investors. You will get your money from where? The pension fund, the sovereign wealth funds, the people who accumulate capital, and you will be a vehicle for them to invest their money. And they will give it to you because they have a certain set of expected returns. So for you, it is important to understand how this story is going to unfold going forward. Right? Now, this is the global historical interest rates from 1788 all the way to 2014 year. Okay. And these are the gray lines, the gray areas are recessions. So this is what happened between after the war and all the way up to the 80s. Right? The economy expanded. And then from here on, somewhere after Mr. Walker came in, it started to, rates were wrung out up until here. Okay. The largest reduction of rates in the history of the world. So I'm going to skip this. You can read through this by yourself. So the projected trend going forward is that rates are likely to increase because the investment in the world is likely to increase. You disagree, Miles?
I do. Yeah, we're seeing negative rates right now in Europe, and it's, I don't know, pretty wild.
But no. Think about it. Why is it so in Europe? Look at Europe. Europe's demography is what is happening to demographics in Europe. The Russians are not producing. The German population has gone down. I don't know about the French. Population is not changing. The only places where population is increasing is in places in South Asia and Africa. China is also not increasing. You are very lucky to be born, huh? One child policy. I was also lucky because we had a 2-child policy, but not enforced like that. We had there was advice from the government to my parents. Should be ours 2 hours, something like that. 2 children, have 2 children. But what will likely to happen with all this new demand for infrastructure? I believe continued demand for infrastructure in China, but China has a different way to finance it, which keeps it slightly out of the world system. But infrastructure development in Africa and South Asia is going to be preeminent place where there's going to be a demand for capital. India has just started. By the time China was 30 years ago, India has just started. And Africa's population is 2 billion, going to be 2.5 billion in the next 10-15 years. Entire Europe in its geographic mass is a small fraction of the mass of Africa. There's so much natural resources. So there are views that, I'm not taking intermediate term, I'm talking long term, right? Unless you find some way of creating infrastructure where there is it's not capital intensive. If it is capital intensive, it be required. So what will be the implication of these? And therefore the rates are likely to go up. So the implication would be that when you invest in companies, your returns are going to be likely to be lower. Gone are the days of 8%. We are already seeing in the West. Right? The struggle with most of the sovereign wealth funds, most large pension funds is where are we, or defined pension plans. Pension plans where the company is committed to providing you an annuity-like payment upon your retirement. Where are they going to get the money? And they have to take on more risk to move to it. So it is inevitable in any aspect of your professional life that you will face going forward from here. If you're based in Europe, you're based in United States, inevitably you will have to look globally. Your jobs, your future professional life has to be global. And I want to go to this place. These are trade flows and all. They did that though. These are some slides of what's happening in the world. Well, after 2008, when global capital flows had completely come to a stop, they have been invigorated. One of the reasons why the crisis came about was when countries that have large supply of capital to supply to the world, and countries that have a large demand of capital, um, sometimes can really screw up the dynamic that happened leading up to 2008. The Chinese were manufacturing, we were buying. And when the Chinese were manufacturing, they were collecting US dollars. The US dollars were reserved in the Chinese Federal Reserve Bank, the Treasury. And they invested the money in US Treasury, and therefore drove up the price of the US Treasury. As a result of that, the yields on US Treasury went down. And when the yields on US Treasury go down, what happens?
Borrow more.
Your cost of capital goes down. Your cost of capital goes down, then your borrowing becomes very cheap. When you borrow, you go on a borrowing frenzy. That's what happened. The problem was not some bankers. Bankers are the worst of the. Any bankers in this room, by the way? I'm a banker, so I can say about myself. They will do because they're a part of the system. They don't have to apply their mind. Yes.
I have one quick question. I'm still not quite sure with how the global real interest rate is being determined. Like each country sets their interest rate by buying and selling bonds and changing the money supply, and regardless of the fact of what investment in the country is, the other banks set their interest rates of the given one via monetary policy, right?
Real interest rates are not set. You cannot directly observe real interest rates. But the concept of real interest rates is there is all this availability of capital and there is a demand for capital, right? So money flows. And then let's say you want to invest in Swaziland. You go to a place where they have investors who would like to invest, right? You are representing Swaziland. And the investors would say, what is the inflation in Swaziland? And they will demand certain returns accordingly if they invest in Swaziland treasury, right? So if you extract out of the inflation and the ability at price which you are getting the money, that is your real rate of money. And that can be across different countries around the world, wherever in the world you are. Okay? It's an extracted information, but it is all the good investors, all major central banks, their usual focus is on the real rates of return. As real estate investors also, your focus should only be on the real return, never on the nominal return. It just happens to be an aberration in the more recent past that real and nominal are not so different. But any investor worth their while does not really care about nominal returns, only cares about real returns, especially in a global world. So this shortfall is what is called trade imbalances. An imbalance is where let me give you an example of what imbalance looks like. After 1945, the Marshall Plan was put in place. The United States wanted the European economy to recover. It was in everybody's interest for the European economy to recover because as a result of that, it will be more peaceful, people's lives will be better. So one of the important things of a Marshall Plan was to try to resurrect the currencies that had broken apart in Europe. Imagine 1945, going to buy Deutschmark, French franc. What will you do with it? Not worth a piece of paper. So the United States and even the British pound sterling, Britain was the preeminent power at that time. Pound sterling needed support. But pound sterling was already on a gold standard, and they were able to be on the gold standard because they were getting all the gold and the silver from the colonies. That was their saving grace. But for the major European economies, there was nothing. So the United States came in and said, we want to buttress up your currency. And they did. So they decided to back the European currencies with the US dollar, but investors will not agree to that. They say, what does it mean to have the US dollar? What are you backed with? That's why the United States got on the gold standard again. In 1945. $35 was backed by 1 ounce of gold. Because of the dollar's backing with a metal like gold, and then dollar going to back the French franc and the euro and the German mark, those countries' currencies, because they were now backed by this, stabilized and allowed them to recover the European economy. And then what happens?
Germans went too far in their recovery.
Yeah, but German, you cannot stop the German engineering, right? If you can, show me the trick, right, Victor? You can't really. It's just amazing. So Germany became industrial powerhouse again. Immediately after the war, America was lending. And as the German economy grew again, by the 1950s, 60s, Germany became the exporter of the world again. And when they became an exporter, let's see what happens. They are selling more cars to the United States. The United States, people who are buying the cars here are sending them dollars. And they're storing the dollars. What does that storage of dollar does? It makes the Deutschmark even stronger. Because it is backed by the dollar, and the dollar is backed by the gold. And as that velocity of accumulation of dollars in Europe increases so rapidly, what is the implication for United States? Every time the Germans say, you know what, take your dollars, give us the gold, United States has to go find out gold. And it became very onerous. That's why in August 1971, under the Nixon administration, all of a sudden, without any pre-announcement, the United States went from a gold-backed currency, dollar became from a gold-backed currency to a fiat currency again. This is what happens where there is an imbalance like that, a big imbalance. Something gives. And what gave in this case, the position of the dollar was not, you could not hold that. And now when the dollar got off the gold standard, what happens then? In 1956, when dollar was trying to recover, becoming much more, there was a French finance minister. His name was Gerhard Stern. Have you heard his name?
I think it was a little before my time.
1956. He was the finance minister in 1956. And he made a comment which became very famous in the monetary policy circles, which is, he was very unhappy because of the dollar's preeminent position in the world. And he said, you have such an exorbitant privilege. We don't know why. Effectively saying, you don't deserve this privilege. There's a geopolitics, they're all, thoughtful people, and they say their heart, which is okay. In 1971, in August, when the Treasury Secretary of the United States made that announcement, he was a former Texas governor. He said, he got his revenge, intellectual revenge. He said, the dollar is our currency, it is your problem now. Because Europeans were expecting that the gold will be delivered. The French did not recover that much, but the Germans had. All the gold would have been delivered to Germany. And now nothing has to be delivered to Germany. Gold stays in a vault, right?
Fundamental shift. So this is called imbalance. Major imbalances are canaries in the coal mine for major economic shifts. 2008 was a major economic imbalance where there was a lot of dollars accumulated in China and we were just consuming manufactured products coming out of China. And as a result of that, after 2008, the Chinese economy had to reorient itself away from export-led growth. You guys must have heard about this. From export-led growth to a more consumer-centric growth, consumer-driven growth of model of the economy. And when we study Chongqing Tianli, we will discuss that a little bit more, how that came about and what are the implications in terms of urban finance. And so these big picture, macro, monetary issues, global trade issues, fiscal issues, currency issues, geopolitical issues, to be a truly global investor, all these areas of thought have to be your forte. You cannot just leave it to a discounted cash flow analysis. It will get you nowhere. That is the point of this conversation. Okay. Understanding the big picture intricacies of how all this works. How is China able to grow so fast? What is it about certain other countries that have not allowed them to grow so fast? These are big questions related to monetary and fiscal policies. How countries treat their capital. What do you mean by capital in the first place? Right? When I start my real estate finance class, I talk about money. What is money? Remember, guys? As part of this course, the course of your life, you should know what is capital. Capital is not necessarily money. Capital can emerge from different sources. When you're manufacturing a car and you're retaining the information and know how you're creating capital domestically. When you are controlling your banks in a way that allows you access to cheap capital to build huge infrastructure projects at the cost of domestic consumers, there is another way to create capital. Rather than go borrow money in the international markets when you have to go and unleash land on which you are sitting as a huge repository of capital, that is also capital. You never get rich by making money. You get rich by accumulating capital. Understanding the nature of capital is absolutely essential, and how people protect capital. There's so many other discussions to come. This is, anyway, we'll stop here. This Sunday, I will send you the room number and 7 East 12th, and we will take on the discussion of Heinz goes to Rio, and we will also expand a little bit more in depth into what this, especially the second part of that equation, how to treat it practically in terms of arriving at thinking about cost of capital. Okay. And then Baupost we will discuss next Thursday in this class. Yes, guys. We're leaving 5 minutes early because we had no break. That's why. Why we, what I will do is I will just